Well, thank you all for attending today, and I'm really excited to talk with you about the idea of friendship and some information that we know about friendship in children and adults with autism. So I'm going to present some descriptive information about what we've learned so far, and then I'm really excited to turn it over to Latha and learn more about interventions to help support social skills in people with autism. So as we begin and get started today, I want to think with you a little bit about what we mean by the word friendship. We talk a lot about social interactions in autism, and I think friendship is a really special type of social relationship. So we all have many different kinds of social relationships in our lives, from acquaintances to groups of people we interact with at school or at work. But friendships are a very special type of peer relationship that can occur across the lifespan. So we have friends as young children, and we also have friends as older adults. There are lots of different definitions of friendship, but most of them share these common features. So we think about friends as people that we are very close with, people we trust. Friends are characterized by this idea of mutual affection. So friendship's not one-sided. Both people really enjoy one another and enjoy spending time together. Friendship's also really characterized by this idea of companionship and preference. So if you have a group of children and two of them are friends with one another, they'll often prefer to spend time together over the other peers in the group. We also think about friendship as a relationship that is longer in duration than just an acquaintance. So you're interacting with one another over time, sharing activities, and there's a real sense of back and forth or reciprocity. So that's how we define friendship generally. And I want to talk a little bit about why friendship is important and why I think we should be thinking about it in supporting people with autism. So friendship, what we know about friendship generally is that in people without autism, having friendships promotes very positive social development, cognitive development, and emotional development. So children from very young ages learn a lot from their friends. They learn what's okay and what's not okay to say or do. They learn how to regulate their own emotions within the context of that relationship, and it can be very helpful for them over time. We also know that having a friend can really help you feel better about yourself, and it can help with happiness and overall well-being. And that's the case not only in children, but also across the lifespan. So when we look at people who do or do not have friends, even into older adulthood, we know that those who have friends tend to be happier and have a greater sense of life satisfaction. In children, we also know that having friends helps kids feel more that they belong at school and in other places, and they generally have a better perception of school if they have friends there. And as a result, we see stronger academic performance among children who have good friends. So these are all really important things, and so it makes studying friendship a pretty important topic as well. We know that in people with autism, social difficulties can be part of that. So having trouble making friends or developing relationships is very common. And we do know that compared to children without autism, those with autism have fewer friends when we look at the total number of friends. And for those who have friends, they often describe less companionship and less of a sense of closeness in those friendships. They also tend to be a little bit briefer in duration than children without autism. When we look again at the nature of friendships, as a whole, children with autism tend to get together less often with their friends and have less shared activities than children without autism. So we know a bit about what friendships look like in autism, and I think there are still some unanswered questions. So I'm going to talk with you for the next few minutes about the results of some of our studies, just looking at the nature of friendship and in children with autism as well as adults with autism. One thing I do want to mention before we get into some of the specific studies is that we also know that contrary to some myths that have been out there, people with autism do want to have social relationships and often experience loneliness as a result of their difficulties. So I think this also highlights the importance of really understanding friendship and how we can support people on the spectrum. Loneliness is a little bit different from social isolation. So the idea of loneliness is that someone really wants to have friends or wants to have relationships and feels unfulfilled or sad about difficulties or a lack of relationships. So we'll come back to loneliness in just a minute. So the first study I want to share with you was done in 2010. My colleague Steve Canny and I worked on this study together. And we were interested in this topic because we were interested in friendship, and we also were interested in helping to reduce anxiety and depression in children and adolescents with autism, because we know that kids and adults with autism are at high risk for that. And we also know that in the general population, if you have at least one good friend, that can lead to less anxiety and depression and greater well-being. So our question was, among children with autism, does friendship really play a protective role for them? Does it help them in terms of depression and anxiety? So to answer that question, we looked at data from about 1,200 children with autism who were part of the Simon Simplex collection study. Many of you on the call today may have participated in that study. And our sample was mostly boys and ranged in age from 4 to 17. And we looked at measures that were collected as part of that study to get a sense of both friendship and depression and anxiety. The measure that we used to look at friendship from this study was taken from a parent interview in which a clinician asked parents to tell them if their child had a best friend or close friends. And then based on their response, we were able to group children into one of these 4 groups. The first group had a best friend that would be characterized by a close reciprocal relationship, kind of like what I talked about in the definition of friendship. The second group had some friendship relationships, but those relationships were not especially close and maybe not reciprocal. And then the third group, or the number 2 score, had relationships with peers, but only in prearranged settings. And then the final group had no friendship relationships that involved sharing or reciprocity at all. So that's how we define friendship in the study. And what we found was that looking separately at boys and girls, about a fourth of the sample really didn't have any peer relationships that could be defined as friendships. And about a third of both boys and girls had relationships, but only in school or within some type of structured group setting. And then about a fourth of the sample had friendships that were friendships, but were kind of limited in closeness. And 16% of boys and 11% of girls had good quality reciprocal friendships that kind of matched that description that I described earlier about friendship. So that was just a descriptive information that we found from the sample. And then when we looked to see if friendships were related to anxiety and depression, were they protective for these children, we found something very interesting. So after we accounted for the effects of IQ and autism symptoms, we actually found that children who had the most anxiety and depression were not the ones with no friendships, but were the ones who had limited friendships. So they had some relationships, but they were not good quality relationships. And that's illustrated in this graph here. So that actually was a surprising result to us, and we thought a lot about what that might mean. And we started to hypothesize that it could be that these are the children who really want to develop relationships and really do want to have friendship, but are not very successful in developing good quality reciprocal relationships. And so that may lead to more anxiety and depression as a result. So that was the kind of findings from this first descriptive study. We were left with a lot more questions than answers on this one. So as a next step, Kristen Dobkin and I have just published a study looking at activities in relation to friendship in children with autism. So we were just curious about how children with autism may develop friendships and if there are opportunities outside of interventions that could be helpful for promoting them. And one of those opportunities would be extracurricular activities. So just a basic question, do children who participate in more of those activities have more friends, or are they more likely to have friends? For this study, we had almost 130 children with autism, again, mostly boys in this sample. And we asked parents to tell us about their children's friendships and their activities. For the friendship measure, we asked parents how many close friends their children had. And then we also asked them to list up to 3 activities in 3 different categories that the child may have participated in. So some children did not participate in any of these types of activities, and some participated in multiple activities across groups. Just to show you the kinds of things that the sample was engaged in, it looked to be that hobbies were the most common activity across our sample. So over half of the children in the sample engaged in 3 hobbies. Very few had no hobbies at all. And most of the hobbies that were reported tended to be more solitary in nature, so playing video games, reading, working on the computer, and some were related to special interests. And by comparison, fewer children were participating in clubs that were more social in nature. So this is kind of the lay of the land when we looked at the activities in our sample. And we also found similar results when we looked at number of friends to our previous study. So just over half of the sample were not reported to have a best friend. 18% had one good friend, and then fewer children had multiple friendships. And when we looked at the relationship between friendship and activity participation, we did find that those children who participated in more activities had more friends and were more likely to have at least one friend. So again, this sample was cross-sectional, so we can't really know for sure if being in activities leads to the development of friendships. It was really just an association. So we'll need to do longitudinal studies to find out if we involve a child in an activity, does that lead to the development of friendships? So the final study I want to talk about is moving from childhood into adulthood, and this study was published in 2014 and really focused on understanding friendships in adults with autism. This has been not as well studied as friendship in children, and I think it's an important issue because adults with autism are at even higher risk for anxiety and depression, and we wonder if loneliness may play a role in that relationship. So the question that I had in this study was whether friendship may play an emotionally protective role for adults with autism. And for this sample, we recruited 108 adults with autism who were involved in the Interactive Autism Network, and we had a more balanced sample here. So we had just over half of the sample who were men and 47% were women. The respondents answered a lot of questions about their relationships, their friendships, their sense of loneliness, and their overall well-being and symptoms of anxiety and depression. So we found that in this sample, over half the sample reported that they did have a close or best friend, and about 39% did not. And we also asked them to tell us a little bit about how often they interacted with their best friend. So for those of the respondents who did have a close friend, it seemed like they were spending a lot more time interacting using texting or social media. Most of the respondents interacted with their friend using electronic devices several times a day or at least once a day, and were less likely to meet face-to-face or talk by phone, although a good percentage of the sample did do that at least once a week. So when we looked at the relationship between well-being and anxiety and depression and social interactions, we did find that the adults who reported higher levels of loneliness were unhappy. So they had much higher levels of depression and anxiety. They were also less satisfied in general with life and had lower self-esteem. And we found that for those adults who had a close friend, they were less lonely than those without. And among those with close friends, if their relationship was even closer, when we asked about relationship closeness, that also was associated with lower loneliness. And then when we asked them how many friends they had, the more friends that an individual reported was associated with less loneliness. So we think that the take-home message from these descriptive studies is that reducing loneliness may be a really important intervention target. So that may be helpful for reducing symptoms of depression and anxiety in individuals with autism, particularly adults with autism. And this, again, is counter to the idea that people with autism don't experience loneliness. In fact, we found that a number of them do. And so the other take-home message, I think, from this work is that helping people to build very close and reciprocal friendships may also be important to consider as an intervention target when we're hoping to enhance well-being, both for children and adults with autism. So it may be important not just to help make social connections, but to help people build those long-lasting reciprocal relationships. So I want to thank you again for your attention, and I've listed the references to our studies here on this slide, and I'm excited to hear about intervention approaches now that we've talked about the lay of the land.
Well, thank you, Micah, for setting that up and for giving us the background that really has driven some of the work on social skills that I do in school-age children and adolescents. My talk today is going to provide an overview of social skills models that have some evidence. There are a lot out there that have some evidence at each sort of stage of the lifespan. And so it really is just touching on some exciting things happening in research on social skills interventions in early childhood, in school age and adulthood, and similar to Micah's comment, and I will say here, there has been far less, but it is emerging. So the questions I'm hoping to answer, or at least touch on today, are what are important goals for social skills and youth with autism? What therapies are appropriate at each developmental stage that address those goals? And where we can, what is the evidence for these therapies? And I like to start off with this slide because I do think that what drives us in social skills research is this idea that we are in a position, and fortunately the technology is improving, to help us improve, as Dr. Grandin says, to adapt to the social world, but really retain the qualities of the individual with autism presenting. So started going right into early childhood. There are, as sort of people growing up and developing friends, there are sort of different tasks at different stages of life. And this schema from Dr. Klin and Jones from Emory, I think, provides a nice overview of the types of general goals and how social skills and social development diverges in individuals with autism as we get through the lifespan. So early on in social development in early childhood, the focus is typically on dyadic interactions with a parent, caregiver, or sort of one small group interactions. And the goal here ideally is to focus on building functional, spontaneous communication, and as social as that can be, the better. Fortunately, we've had a wealth of research on early interventions for individuals with autism. And what has emerged over the last decade is a shift in some ways to modeling these early interventions to focus on early critical social skills. As a group These interventions are often called naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, NDBIs. The brand names that the community might have heard of, the Early Start Denver model, pivotal response training. And as a category, both ABA and NDBIs and other early interventions targeting social, cognitive, adaptive, and language skills in individuals with autism have strong effects. Typically, the effects are in the 0.7 range for IQ and adaptive behavior, suggesting that there are strong effects. In the social range, those effects tend to be more moderate. And so these NDBIs are focused on building, and I'll go through some of the diagram here, building early critical social skills through natural language interchange, focusing on adults' responsiveness to child cues to sort of work with the child with where they are at in terms of motivation, developing shared engagement in materials, positive affect, utilizing at the core ABA principles to teach and promote these skills. And the focus of these skills, again, is both verbal and nonverbal interactions. Our program is doing research on how we can transport some of the effective NDBI strategies in these modular forms to the community in a more accessible way. So we are working with a model, NDBI known as Project Impact. The module within that is called Reciprocal Imitation Training, and the goal of this is fairly straightforward. How do we teach children to get motivated to mimic and imitate the people around them? And so the study is known as a Mirror Me study. It's a 10-week e-health intervention where families will watch 5 sessions, or not watch, they'll go through a self-guided 5-session or 5-week online webinar, basically, and instructional program, and then have 5 weeks of coaching following that. And the goal, again, is to teach parents how to engage with their kids, make playtime fun through imitating their child's actions, so in turn the child will imitate them. So when we have a video, I think that does a much better job of showing the progress and the goals of this therapy. And so when, is it Vincent or Karina, if you're ready, if you could cue the video. So what I hope was clear from there was the real change in both the fun that the parent and child were having together in the same activities and the slow progress that the child has made with simple prompts like you do to mimic the mom's actions. So that reciprocal nature that is the foundation of the friendships that we'll build later, starting very early on in development, is a goal of these modular interventions. And this study is ongoing. We use the Spark Research Match actually to recruit families for this. The initial pilot study has suggested this has been validated in vivo, sort of in typical therapy settings, and the telehealth version has suggested that the parent knowledge and self-efficacy have improved in families who receive Mirror Me versus a treatment as usual control group. And hopefully we'll have results soon to share. So moving on to school age, the goals of therapy shift quite a bit there. Now we're working with kids often who are in bigger settings with their peers. And so one conceptual sort of model that has helped me, both as a therapist and as common sort of in the community, is to really think about autism, particularly in this point in development, in the way that we think about other learning issues like reading and language, or reading and math, and thinking about it as a learning disability. And what the implications of that are is that the social skills, the skills that are difficult for the kids that we're working with, would be taught in the setting that they're used the most, which is typically in schools or in, let's say, after-school activities, using developmentally appropriate methods and scaffolding. And I'll talk a little bit more about the social learning disability concept in a minute. In terms of goals for kids in school and school-age children, really, regardless of what model of support they're receiving in schools, ideally, we're aiming for integration into the academic setting and finding some level of success in that kind of setting. The beginnings of peer relationships. By 4 to 5, children have the foundation, typically developing children have the foundation for building very meaningful peer relationships and reciprocal relationships. So thinking about that as the goal for our children with autism. And of course, health, mental health, and family and parenting dynamics are also goals for these children. I'm going to focus mostly on the peer relationships here. Sorry, I'm going forward. And I apologize, I was moving the wrong slide. So the first set of interventions that I wanted to touch on are considered peer-mediated interventions. And these are really powerful tools for children in the school age period. And these can take many different forms that families and schools often have heard of, like lunch buddies, or sort of having after-school programs with social groups with peers, or integrating peers into academics or extracurricular activities like theater groups, or that's one model that's emerging. One very nice study that was done by Connie Kasari and her colleagues had looked at training peers in schools to work with children with autism versus children with autism who receive training directly. So the two comparison groups, the groups who are training the peers to work with children with autism, or the child with autism getting an intervention. And in this study, there were significant improvements found in what we call social network salience. And social networks are this idea that we've all faced, that there are different individuals have different sort of networks and density of networks around kids or people who are connected with them. And the idea with children with autism or children with really any mental health condition is bringing them from the edge of that network closer into the center of the network as possible. And Dr. Kasari's group found that training peers versus directly intervening with the child alone in the school system improved the closeness of that child with autism into the center of the network. The number of kids who nominated that child with autism, thought of them as a friend, increased with the peer-mediated interventions. and the teachers' reports of social skills also improved, suggesting that there are really important ways that schools can work with peers and develop programs to promote friendships in children with autism. The next slide is really provides an overview of what I mentioned on sort of what it means to think of ASD as a social learning disability, and what thinking about how those peer-mediated interventions might be modeled or dealt with in both the formal sense of the interventions that were developed, but also generally. And so in addition to what I discussed about teaching in the natural setting, what a social learning disability suggests is that we would teach core deficits, so I'll touch on what those might be in a minute, but also really importantly using compensatory strategies. So if a child with a learning disability has difficulty decoding phonics, we are both helping them decode phonics, but at the same time providing read-alouds and providing materials that are at their level in addition to teaching them advanced levels. So scaffolding is a really important piece of thinking about learning, social learning for children with autism or any other social learning challenges. Another model, in addition to peer-mediated interventions that are often used in school-age children, are social skills groups. So the IAN network, which Micah mentioned for one of her studies, did a really nice survey of families and looking at participation in social skills groups among respondents. And overwhelmingly, about over 75%, about 80% of families had reported moderate to high levels of improvement from participating in social skills groups. That's the pie graph on your right. And then there's a bar graph at the bottom, and with the number 9, the blue bar in the middle is 99. That's showing that the main targets for social skills groups for children with autism are social, which makes sense, and then communication goals. Social skills training, fortunately, has been studied much more over the last about 5 to 10 years. There are several models of social skills groups. I didn't put all the different ones on here. Once when I looked, there's about 30 that have either single subject publications or manuals that are available on Amazon or bookstores. So what they have in common, the model that's typically called social skills training groups, some of the brand names here might be the Peers curriculum or Jed Baker's books. What they have in common are a general structure or framework for teaching social skills, which is identifying, typically it's a teacher identifying a goal for what they might learn. Let's say it's greetings, teaching what it looks like through modeling and practice, and then providing prompts during the practice and homework, and encouraging homework, which means reinforcing, providing motivation or tokens or whatever it might be within the natural setting as well as in the clinical setting. So this model, social skills training groups, like as I said, had been studied, but not to the degree some of the early intervention research has been done. And so one of the largest and one of the largest trials was actually done in Germany, not the U.S. And in Germany, they looked at children ages 8 to 17, comparing social skills training, called SST, to treatment as usual, which is whatever they were receiving in the community at that time, as well as social skills training with an additional parent training component. And there are 2 studies that were published from this trial, and actually many more, but the 2 that I'm going to focus on are the one on your left looks at the immediate outcomes from social skills training compared to treatment as usual and standard of care. And the one on your right looks at all 3 groups and what are the impacts of parent training. And the brief summary is that the social skills training was more effective in adolescents and females when comparing social skills training to treatment as usual. However, at 3-month follow-up, it was a 15-session group. 3 months after therapy ended, they followed up with the families and asked them to report, parents reporting social skills on the social responsiveness scale, which is a scale of social impairment and symptoms of autism. And at 3 months, that effect was no longer maintained. And this is a common report that we hear both in research as well as in our clinical practice, that these short-term therapies often do not yield the time, do not maintain the effects. In terms of generalization, so how do these treatments carry over from the clinic into different settings? One of the interesting findings here, which is somewhat expected given our knowledge of how important parents and families are in interventions, are that social skills training with the parent training component led to improvements on teacher reports of social behavior. And that's the only place. The other two groups did not have teachers reporting improvements in social behavior. I know I'm running a little bit tight on time, so I might need an extra 5 minutes, Vincent. Is that okay? Or maybe not. So I'll go until I'm told to. Okay, thank you. Very great. So another type of social skills group or social skills model that is available and has been studied in children in the school age range are social skills groups specifically targeting impairments that we have found in autism, and so specifically targeting social cognition and the broader community social thinking targets, because we know that individuals with autism, through both neuroscience and behavioral and cognitive studies, have a common set of challenges when it comes to social cognition. One is in identifying emotions. Another is in the ability to attribute beliefs, thoughts, feelings, or intentions to others. So theory of mind is what this refers to. And then the third tends to be in ambiguous or non-literal language. And we have a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon here where the end is, let's see how mom jumps out of her skin. And there are many books available that that teach kids stories about how to dissect idioms and resources. And so there are therapy models in addition to the general materials out in the public that have been designed, and this is a research area that I've been involved in, designed to specifically focus on emotion recognition, theory of mind, and these nonverbal or non-literal language understanding. And so we had a model that we studied that was published a few years ago in 2015 called Nonverbal Synchrony, sort of how do you teach gestural imitation and synchrony, so my body language matches your body language, emotion recognition, as well as theory of mind, to 8 to 11-year-olds with autism who are verbal with IQs above 70. This was explicitly a cognitive behavioral therapy approach, which mimics some of the social skills training models that I mentioned. And what we found from this study in about 70 kids was that their parents had reported improvements in a child's social behavior after the 12-session intervention. So the social behaviors that they were rating were specifically focused on empathy and responding to other individuals' feelings and thoughts. However, we also did tests of children's ability to process social cues on neuropsych tests, like pictures of people's emotions and trying to interpret other people's intentions in scenarios. And we did not see improvements when children received the social thinking group compared to a very high quality play group. So kids come together, they feel safe, they have a lot of visual supports, but they're not learning social thinking skills. So we find effects after 12 sessions for the NETT therapy on social behavior, but not on social cognition. And we also saw that children with higher verbal IQs tended to respond better to the intervention. Interestingly, we also conducted imaging in a subset of children. What this slide shows are common findings when it comes to brain correlates of social deficits in autism, one being in the fusiform face area, which helps process facial cues, and another being in the superior temporal sulcus, which is a region associated with responding to social sounds. and the third being in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is associated with these theory of mind tasks that we had done. And a colleague of mine, Ting Wang, had conducted this sub-study and found that children who went through the imaging paradigm, about half of the children went through the imaging paradigm, had changes post-treatment. Children who received NETT, the social thinking intervention, had changes in this medial prefrontal cortex, this theory of mind region, after the 12-session therapy, suggesting that while we might not be seeing improvements on these neuropsych measures, that we are possibly changing the way the brain is processing these emotional cues, and that there's both behavioral and early signs of cognitive shifts in the way children are learning about social cognition. And to wrap up, I wanted to touch on social interventions for adolescents and adults. And again, as Micah had mentioned, there are unfortunately not as many strong studies in this area, but they are emerging. And before we talk about what those studies are, I do want to sort of present some of what we know about, in addition to what Micah had described about friendships, about adults with autism in terms of social outcomes. One is that we know that parental involvement and peer relationships, in addition to IQ and language, are the strongest predictors of good outcomes in adults with autism. And we've had important discussions as a research community and in a larger national community about what are important goals. And among those, as you will see, are independent living as well as community integration. And so the thoughts on social integration and social skills development for adults with autism really is this idea of maximizing a sort of more holistic approach where the community, social work, as well as mental health individuals are involved. The interventions that are emerging, which we don't have strong data on yet, but we're optimistic about, are interventions that are tailoring sexuality and relationship intimacy goals to adults with autism. We are also hearing and learning about more effective strategies in educational and vocational educational settings about how to maximize social integration within workplaces, and hopefully we'll have more data to present then. And I'm going to end with just a summary slide, sort of thinking about where we go from here. And one is really to think about, as we've seen in other models, communities such as ADHD, a need to really think about social skills interventions in this lifespan treatment model. What is needed at every stage of development, and how do we develop comprehensive programs to do this? And then the second is clearly our interventions are working, but they could be better because they're not addressing the needs or sort of maximizing really the social goals of individuals. Where we need to improve maintenance, we need to improve generalization, and so thinking creatively about how to optimize or augment interventions through both technology as well as augmenting with medications where that seems appropriate. And I guess I will end there for the question and answer period.
Okay, thank you so much. We did get a question about theory of mind. If you could just go over that concept again.
Sure.
You could break it down.
Sure. So theory of mind is I guess it's a metric about how well an individual can take somebody else's perspective. Like can you put yourself in somebody else's shoes? It's at the core of it, it's empathy, but it's the cognitive version of empathy. So not just sort of feeling or sharing feelings or understanding the feelings of others, but thinking and being able to predict what might be going on in somebody else's mind. And it's really an important skill that develops in many kids, and most actually typically develop in children as early as 4 to 5 years old. And it's the foundation of children being able to negotiate problematic situations. In marital relationships, they talk about, or marital therapy, they talk about this issue of mind reading and how problematic mind reading is for therapy or marital or for intimate relationships. But in some ways, we're teaching mind reading in and is kind of like a theory of mind model in children to get them set up to sort of think about, if somebody hits me, what could they be thinking? What could they be feeling? And what are the different options for their thoughts and behavior, thoughts and feelings? And let me try out a couple of things that I can do if I think that they're feeling angry or sad. I hope that explains that.
Okay, thank you. I know that you both mentioned IQ as a part of setting up your studies and that it's related to results. Could I have you both maybe touch on why IQ is important and how it can impact the setting up your study? And then also, just more broadly, we had a number of people commenting that because autism is a spectrum, how do you sort of do these interventions for individuals that might have higher or lower IQs? I know that was kind of a lot. So, Micah, if you want to take a stab first.
Sure, yeah, that's a really good question, and I didn't really explain why we controlled for IQ in some of our studies. One of the findings that I didn't talk about is that we found that when we looked at friendship in our samples, IQ was related to friendship development, so the children who had lower IQs were less likely to have friends, and so we wanted to actually control for that variable in our analysis, so that when we looked at the relationship between friendship and emotional functioning, we weren't, IQ wasn't interfering with our ability to detect that relationship. So that's why we controlled for it. I do think that the idea that we need to tailor and adapt our interventions for people at different levels of cognitive ability is a very excellent point and is a limitation of some of the research that we have available now. The study that I did on adults with autism was really a high-functioning sample, so I don't know if we would have found the same results if we included individuals who were not able to read and respond to the questions. So we are challenged a little bit by our measurement limitations. So we don't have a good way to assess loneliness, for example, in someone who's not able to speak. So I think we need to do a better job of thinking about how to do that.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Latha.
Yeah, I can speak to a little bit about how IQ plays a role in interventions. And I think that the easiest way, as both the clinician sort of investigator that I think about this, is to think to our understanding where there's gaps, our understanding of social development in autism is that many of the sort of the goals that are outlined in the schema I presented do occur in autism, but might be at a delayed or different timeline. Right, and so the idea that early on we need to focus on these dyadic, building sort of one-to-one or one small group relationships, moving to peers, and then moving to community, are things that we keep in mind when we work with individuals with autism who are lower on the IQ spectrum than the cognitive behavioral interventions that we might develop, or that I presented. So we would be doing these interventions just modified for the developmental level rather than the age that this individual might be at.
Okay. We had a question about, so as we all know, getting services covered by insurance can sometimes be tricky. Has there been any talk of policy shifting toward getting sort of social skills therapies or training covered by insurance, or do we not know enough yet to even start that conversation?
I can't speak to the policy, what's going on in policy sort of at this moment. I do have to say that the research the reason I actually started the first trial that I presented is this idea that we have individuals that social skills groups weren't covered. We've had pretty strong meta-analyses about social skills groups. I think the last one came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago, showing that social skills group have moderate to treatment, short-term, moderate effects. And in practice, we have found that we are able to get, some insurance companies are covering social skills groups for children with autism. It's not as easy as it is, or common, I think, as it is for others, but there is a slow move. And whether there are actual policy initiatives around this, I'm sorry, I can't speak to it, but it's really worthwhile trying to figure out.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of adults on the line too, and I was wondering if you might be able to speak to, I know there are a lot of workplace programs that are employing individuals on the spectrum, and some of them have mentoring programs. Do you know of any research that has taken a look at these mentoring programs in the workplace, or if maybe that's a starting place for social skills training in adults?
I don't know of any studies either active or published or active in this area. I might have missed them if they recently came out. But it is certainly I know it's a commonly used model, particularly in our region too, and worthwhile studying, but I haven't seen it yet.
Okay. Let's see here. We did have, you kind of addressed this, Latha, but we did have a number of questions about that some of the effects might be short-lived, and how we can address that. Do you have any more thoughts, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that when we do social skills therapies, these targeted social skills therapies, we are doing them in 12-week sessions, both for sort of funding, the models, the medical models that sort of guide our studies or sort of yield these kinds of 12, 15-week sessions. In practice, many clinics, and ours does this too, is that we have different social skills groups that kids rotate in and out of over the course of the year. So a child might be in a social skills group for this 12 session for, let's say, social thinking, and we'll have booster sessions monthly, let's say, for that. And then they might enter another social skills group later in the year for anxiety, or another social skills group targeting play skills. So we'll actually run our social skills interventions in practice through continuously, and as much as a family can, work it into their schedule and afford it and attend, that's been great. Ideally, if we can move these evidence-based models into schools, we'll have a much better chance of providing continuous social skills interventions to children and adults.
Okay. Micah, this question is for you. If you could maybe just go over what you found in regard to other commonly occurring conditions and how related to autism, and how they affect making friends, or I think you had a slide on that specifically.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's interesting because most of our research has focused on friendship as a protective factor, so helping to prevent worsening of depression or anxiety or loneliness. But it's interesting to think about the reverse. So do those co-occurring conditions interfere with social success? And I'm not aware of research that's focused specifically on that question, although there may have been some studies published on that. I think anecdotally, I would expect that that's definitely the case. So for children who have co-occurring ADHD and may have a lot of trouble paying attention in a social interaction, or are very impulsive, that would certainly impact their social success above and beyond their symptoms of autism. Similarly, for people who are very anxious, we know that in kids and adults without autism who have a lot of anxiety, that interferes with your ability to interact with other people, because you're kind of hypervigilant and really worried about the environment or what's happening in the social situation. So I would expect that also to be the case in children with autism who have anxiety. So it may be a bidirectional relationship, that these co-occurring conditions are making it harder for people to engage in the social setting, and that lack of success socially may then contribute to worsening symptoms. But it's a really good question, and I think we probably need to do more research to be able to answer that.
Thank you. I have a two-part question. So one, for the first part would be if you could just go over peer-mediated intervention again and how that works, and then also if there's research on interventions that might be friendship making with individuals who might not be peers and how that could be beneficial. So folks that are older or younger, things like that.
I can take the first one, and I'm trying to read the question or find the question, but I think it was just sort of reviewing it again and understanding how they work. And I covered this. This is often a workshop on its own, so I tried to cover it in one slide. So there are many different models of peer-mediated interventions. The evidence-based one that I described, what it did was it had, like I might have mentioned, two groups. It compared a group of children who received some sort of social skills intervention on their own, children with autism who received social skills interventions directly from a therapist. It had a second group of peers without autism who received interventions on how to interact and promote social skills within recess, lunch, for individuals with autism or individuals who are isolated during these group activities. And there are a lot of different ways, I think, in general, that make these peer-mediated interventions successful. One, who you select as a peer is really important. So there's a lot of thought that goes into selecting peers who are about the same age or grade, who don't have any really negative experiences with that with the particular child or individuals with disabilities in general, who really are the leaders. Often they tend to be children who are socially adept and really just are willing and able to understand sort of skills very quickly. And then, of course, those who are keen to follow adult instruction. So selecting the peers first step, and then they go through a short-term training program about how to encourage individuals, kids with autism, to join into social interactions. And I know we're running close on time, but there are books out there that are focused on these sort of friendship skills and peer-mediated skills, and I can try to put that as a reference at the end of this before we upload our webinar.